Hi everybody, Adrian Plass here.
Yes, and Bridget, hello. And I think we're number 41, which is pretty extraordinary.
We are number 41 of Sounding the Shallows.
We are.
Yeah.
And one of the nice things is that we are still hearing from people, and it does make it really special, doesn't it?
Oh, I love the fact that people keep on coming back to us. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate it. There was a rather interesting one we had from a lady this time. She says, thank you both for your continued broadcast. It's a pleasure.
That was very nice.
And she says, I now have a new Friday routine. I wash hair, dry it, put Velcro rollers in it, and then I watch your vlog. So you can picture me now. Couldn't do that if it was on Zoom. And when you finished, it's time to take the rollers out. I'm glad we have a use in the world.
It's good to be useful.
Now,
And
can
there
you
was another
quickly
one.
summarise
sorry.
that story you told last time about
yes.
the Australian
Well, it was a friend
lady?
of ours who, a very committed Christian actually, and she has a fish on her car, as many Christians like to do, to show that they are Christians. And if you remember, I was talking about when she was up in an upper story car park, parking her car, and her two kids were driving around the bend. And what she actually did was take the fish off her car so that she could shout at her children without giving a bad example.
Right,
of
that
what
was
she
the
believed.
story told
Yeah.
last time. And someone was responding to that story, and he says, it made me think of a near neighbour, viewed by many as a bit of a grump, but he's fine really, who bought a second-hand car with a fish sign screwed onto the back. He didn't know the significance of this until he encountered people who would say things like, praise the Lord, to him, as they pointed at the boot of his car. He was regularly asked, and politely put people right, about his Christian life. When I first heard about this, I wanted to warn him not to park in Keswick during the convention. Sounds unlikely he would have done. I often wonder what impact those people have had on his views about Christians and the person that they follow.
Yes, it's really interesting. This week in particular, we've had several emails about the problems of sharing faith. I think it's because we were talking about the unique selling point that we might have and just how difficult it is. And there was one person said that she tried really hard to get her friend to an alpha group with very little success and actually it all feeling as though it was going wrong. And then they just carried on being friends, and she didn't talk about it anymore. She played a song, I know, which was based on a psalm. But what made the difference was when she went through a really rough week and shared with her how far away from God she felt. And she says that a few years later, she got a phone call to say that actually she now had found faith in God, and that she was... the writer, sorry, there's a lot of she's, the writer was part of this woman's journey. Not in dragging to alpha suppers, but just in actually being vulnerable.
Can we just say a lot of people benefit hugely from going to alpha suppers and are
Of
not necessarily
course they
dragged.
do.
But
they're
we
the
take
people
the
who
point.
choose to go.
Yeah, we take
they're
the
the
point.
people who
Yeah.
choose to go.
Yeah.
And somebody else said that she joined a community cafe and got that response that somebody couldn't stand people shoving religion down the throat. And then after lots of walks, when this person's son was in hospital, she was actually asked to pray for him. And I remember when we moved into County Durham, Adrian, our next door neighbour more or less said that to us, didn't he? When he discovered our strange...
Yeah, it was a very interesting indication that a lot of stuff goes on in people that you don't hear until the crunch comes. And I think the crunch had come for him. And yeah, it came out like a small child saying he got a secret. And it was really very moving.
But he had begun by saying, I hope you don't shove your
Maybe you
religion
don't shove
down
your
my throat.
Christianity down
And
my
that's what
throat,
reminded me.
Yeah.
And you know this unique selling point thing? There was a really lovely, positive and encouraging email, wasn't there?
Yeah, somebody said, I actually think the unique selling point, we use that language ironically, of Jesus is, I actually think it's the resurrection. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, then the whole gospel is true. If he didn't, then the whole thing falls down. Other religions and cultures have their coming back to life stories, often to make sense of a natural phenomenon like the fresh growing of crops in the spring. But the resurrection of Jesus is something that happened for real. So victory over death is quite a good USP.
Yes. And actually, I found that very encouraging because yet again this week has been difficult in the UK, hasn't it? It really has. For those of you who are listening who are not in the UK, you may still have heard about the horrendous murder of a girl who was just walking home, same age as our daughter, which really sort of hit home in particular. But it feels as though, because of this strange year that everybody's had, all sorts of things are coming out of the woodwork. I mean, we talked, didn't we, what seems like months ago, about how people in care homes were suddenly noticed for the first time and thought about, and domestic violence moved up the agenda, and we were thinking, you know, things that we'd just not thought about. They were kind of part of life, really, and they just sort of passed us by until this pandemic.
And they came up like mushrooms overnight, didn't they? And,
Yeah, they did.
people really jumped at it because, for all sorts of reasons, I imagine, because they were good causes, of course, when they were, but also because you need something. You need something inside you to get you moving, that sort of stuff.
Well, last weekend we actually did a Zoom conference, didn't we, for Scargill, and we were talking about the story of Hannah. And I think one of the things that came out for people almost more than any other was the importance of being heard for the first time. And I was thinking about things like the story of blind Bartimaeus, where people were so used to hearing him calling out every day as they went to the temple. They just didn't hear it anymore. They just didn't hear it anymore. Yeah, it's...
Do you think people have been caged too long, perhaps, in some sense?
Well, I do wonder about that.
Yeah.
Because we seem to see again and again an individual thing that happens, and there have been some... I mean, the murder of this girl was a horrendous thing, and there have been many others as well. And it's as though once something is triggered, it becomes an unstoppable surge, doesn't it, really? I was thinking, you know, let's just think over the last couple of years. We started with Me Too, that was before the pandemic, but then we've had the Black Lives Matter, and then we had the storming of the Capitol.
Not that I would equate those two things
at all. No. Well, you say that, but I don't know quite, Adrian, because they come out of
I guess
something bad happening that then is sort of maybe because of social media, maybe because of other things. It just becomes like a surge, a sort of tsunami, really. And now of course,
safe streets.
And now it's safe streets. And again, it's a single situation triggering a huge reaction from people who don't feel they've been heard, and maybe this time they will be.
I feel very confused by it all. I mean, we brought up 3 sons, didn't we? And a daughter, and so we faced some of those things. I think one of the problems I have, I'm a bit like that sculptor, whose name I can't remember, who always saw the back of the thing he was making the sculpture of.
Well, it's Michelangelo, wasn't it?
Well,
oh no,
I can't remember. No, anyway, I was always struck by that, and I think we're always looking behind and round and trying to see what's going on. I wonder whether we lose a clear picture because of that.
Maybe. I mean, one of the placards at that huge gathering of people in Clapham Common that I noticed was "Educate your sons, protect your daughters, educate your sons." And I found myself thinking about all the mothers who've actually done their best, and the many, many sons who have been taught to look after and protect. And I was thinking about our boys. You said about them, well, they couldn't have looked after their sister.
Oh, no, they were wonderful.
Better. But the other thing I thought when I started thinking about the boys was that girls in their lives weren't necessarily the weaker sex. Do you remember the conversation when, because one of them was not quite 7 and the other one was 8, when our daughter was born, and we overheard that conversation, do you remember?
Yes,
in which they said they were not going to spoil her. But because she wasn't going to become one of those bossy girls. And obviously in their primary school there were quite a lot of them. And I now remember another time when we were at, I think it was Take 7, and there used to be these football matches, and our 3 boys were playing on one team. And to my surprise, I found that they were going to play against a team of girls,
Yeah.
and I said to them, "Now you be really careful and chivalrous. I don't want to see any aggression, etc., etc." These girls were tough. And the boys were looking across at me, and it's sort of so.
So it's not easy to teach, is it? Really,
It isn't always easy
no, it's
to
not,
teach.
I of course had a horrendous experience myself. I mean, those who worked with kids in what we used to call kids in care will have no understanding of this really. But I worked in a place where there were 2 boys units and 1 girls unit, teenagers. And I had never, ever worked with girls before. I hardly knew any girls. I knew you.
You didn't have any sisters.
I didn't
did
have
you?
any
So-
sisters.
and you were quite young.
And
Yeah.
I was the senior person on call. So if there was a problem in one of the units, I was supposed to go along and deal with it. And if it's the boys, dealing with boys had always been, well, partly the fact that I was bigger than them. I don't mean I hurt them. I mean that there was a sort of understanding of the balance, and also I kind of understood where they were coming from.
But of course, you were bigger than the girls, weren't you?
it's
And that,
much
in
bigger
a
than-
way,
yeah, but this
was
is
one
the-
of the problems.
Well, we're a long way back from there. I mean, I just didn't understand them. And the phone rang one night, and someone said, "You need to go to the girls' unit because they're causing a lot of problems."
You were kicking off, I
Now,
think, was the expression.
you have to believe me. I was shaking with fear.
Yes,
I
you
had
were.
no idea what to do. So I got into the girls' unit, and there's a number of teenage girls in night dresses rushing around, being wherever they were being. And I looked at them and I thought, what on earth do I do here? And I turned away from them because I really couldn't think what I was going to do. And I was shaking, you know. And I thought, what am I going to say? I've got to turn round now and say something.
What did you do? I can't
turned
remember.
I turned back and I said, I had to turn round then because I was so angry that I was shaking with anger. Now I've given myself a moment and I think we may be able to sort this out. And we did sort of sort it out, but that moment remains in my memory as a dreadful thing. I don't know. But
I suppose the reason I was thinking about that, Adrian, as well, is that has to be in the balance of everything, doesn't it? That, you know, that it isn't to do with the strength of character or the upbringing of girls. It is the fact that in every faith system there has been a problem with women being made to feel second class and often used very, very badly.
in almost every system.
In every faith system and every non-faith system. I don't really understand it. I mean, the thing that I love is that in our faith system we have Jesus.
Yes, that's true. He was a bit revolutionary, wasn't he, really? I think his relationships with women were quite different. And Mary and Martha were clearly his genuine, real friends. It's one of the few bits in the Gospels where you hear the kind of conversation you might hear between any friends. And and with children too. Children were given a respect that was really quite different.
And he loved a bit of what would be the word? A bit of sassiness, really, didn't he? I mean,
I think he liked
people who came back at
being
him.
taken on, the Syrophoenician woman whose daughter was so sick, and he said, well, I don't know how he said it, but he said, why should I give the food that's meant for the children, that means the Israelites, and give it to the dogs, which is the people who are not part of that culture. And she said, well, even the dogs eat the crumbs that come off the table. And I think his eyebrow went up, and he said, "Oh, fair enough then. Yes, your daughter as well." But yeah, maybe he had to learn it a bit, though. You know, he was a truly man, and he did. But people always say about Paul, don't they? What about Paul?
Well, that's the problem.
What about wasn't Paul an anti-woman?
Well, maybe
character?
I've talked about this before. I don't know, but I mean, having loved the journeys of Paul when I was at school and learnt about them, and I thought Paul was brilliant. And then I gradually started hearing more and more and more people very anti-Paul saying it's all Paul's fault.
Yeah.
The whole attitude towards women, the fact that they're used, the fact that they're not respected, it's all Paul's fault. And I found that extremely difficult, really, because I'd admired him so much. And so, as you know, I kind of became a bit obsessed by the whole thing, really, and read so much about him. And the book that I enjoyed writing the most was a book called Dear Paul. And what I did was I took some women, modern women, and I thought, how might they write to Paul? And then I thought, how might Paul respond? And one of the, and I had to get it sort of right, if you remember, because the book had to be passed through via some people who knew all about Paul much more than I did. But so, for example, there's a history teacher called Thea. So there's Thea, who's a history teacher, secondary history teacher, and she is passionate about her girls and really seriously angry with Paul about what she sees as his responsibility in them being treated with such little respect and with so little encouragement. And then I've got Paul, and do remember, this is fictional, but I've got Paul replying to her and saying, can I start by assuming, as you haven't mentioned it, that you are unaware of the position held by women in the first century? You appear to be suggesting that we imposed a more repressive role on women than they were accustomed to, or, at very least, that we supported and encouraged the continuation of evils already present. And then he goes on to contend that actually they brought about some really radical improvements in the position of women and slaves, of course, but that they did it through the men. And that, I think, is key. We hope desperately, in the light of the glorious new truth that under Christ all were equal in the sight of God, to convince men of the vital importance of women and children to their Heavenly Father, and that it wasn't going to be easy. And then my fictional Paul goes on to mention the fact that did Thea know that in Jewish law a woman was considered just one of her husband's possessions, and that every morning the Jewish man would thank God that he hadn't been created Gentile slave or woman.
Yes.
And Paul talks about the ease in which women were divorced, which was just so... And we came across that in Bangladesh, didn't we? That the men could just say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. And that could be the end of the marriage, and the woman could just be thrown out. Same with the Jews. But then, of course, Paul goes on. Oh, yes, I can hear the prosecution saying, but that was the Jews. You were writing to Europeans, imposing your rules on them. Let me put one or two more facts before the jury. Did you know that in Greece a personal prostitute was considered an essential little luxury that no Greek husband could be expected to do without? The wife was there for the purpose of having legitimate children and running the house. She was a prisoner in her own apartment, which only her husband could enter. She would never even appear at meals or any public event. So that kind of role of women was not created, please, by Paul.
No.
There are things that are difficult. The culture
not.
at the time was difficult.
Yeah.
Yes, there's the whole head covering thing, but actually he was trying to educate the men.
Yeah, and yet here we are in a situation now where it's really not a lot better than it was.
No, it's not.
And
well, it is in terms of ambition and careers and all those things.
Yeah, but any sense in which women are considered inferior human beings is ridiculous. Of course it's ridiculous. It's how you do it.
Yeah.
People keep talking and writing and trying, and of course we want that. But you get things like people saying, defund the police.
Oh, that was on one of the placards, wasn't it?
If with no police, there is no recourse for those who are treated. I mean, it's very, very difficult. Over the years, we've encountered some interesting things, haven't we? I remember in South America, apparently the elders, the ministers, were beating their wives.
Oh yeah, it was
It was
quite
part of their
acceptable because
culture.
of the obedience thing.
That's
To
right.
beat them into submission. Absolutely.
And two women actually collected all the ministers together and explained to them, as Paul would have done, I think, that is not right.
Yeah.
That is not what you do.
That is not what it says in the Bible.
And
yeah.
they stopped. And there are other examples of that which are really interesting.
Yeah.
But there is no silver bullet, as somebody
I
on
think it was
television,
Ram said,
the
yeah.
other day. Yeah,
No, there's no
they
silver
were
bullet.
always complex, always complex.
But I think it does involve, on an individual basis and maybe a political basis, maybe a religious basis, constantly looking at and saying, are we accepting as the norm? Just going right back to blind Bartimaeus. Are we just not hearing it and seeing it? But you know, I grew up being told you should never walk alone home.
Yeah,
You have
yeah.
to be very sensible and all the rest of it. And I remember you used to phone Kate on her way home from her
Well,
friend's
it was a bit
house.
nerve-wracking because she'd be walking home in the dark, and I'd be talking to her on the phone. There's nothing I could do. If anything happened, I could reassure her. But we used to worry, didn't we,
Yeah, well,
that
of course
she
we
was
did.
coming back alone.
Yes.
Yeah, and you shouldn't obviously have to worry. But it's going to be a long time before education or law or whatever it is that changes it
Yeah.
makes it safe.
I think we have to pray
for
for
women.
imagination, don't we? And for
We do,
people
yeah.
to maybe just even take a glance, even if they're not Christian, at the way that Jesus was with women. And
Yeah.
that gives us hope, because that's the way one day
Yeah.
it might be.
Yeah, we've got a bit jumbled with all that. It's not easy, is it? I don't quite know whether we pursued a straight path with this.
Of course we didn't
Because
pursue it.
we never do. We'll be very, very interested to hear what other people think about that. So do let us know.
Yes,
And
goodbye.
we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.